The Particular Abilities of Marinette and Her Discovery of Them by Plancer Fun 06, a Miraculous Ladybug, Batman crossover fanfic. Chapter 4, Rules. 4 months later. As awful as that might be to look back on those months, it did teach her some valuable things. Number 1. Always cover your eyes and scarring. If they see them, people will think you are a monster. Number 2. The only place crying gets you is dehydrated and hyperventilating to the point of exhaustion. It took her a solid week after the village, as she had dubbed it, to come to that conclusion. Number 3. Always stay invisible. The mission is to survive, and the quickest way to fail is to be noticed. Those rules were rules for survival. Every single one of them she learned through particularly painful situations that she preferred to pretend didn't happen. Although apparently she wasn't very good at pretending, because she had nightmares about them, and after every nightmare she would wake up with a few stray tears on her face, and her chest tight, ridden with anxiety about those same events happening again. That's why she made the rules. They weren't fun. They were sometimes hard to abide by. But she did it because she couldn't bear to be called monster again. She couldn't bear to see their heart rates skyrocket when they saw her face. She couldn't bear to see their muscles tighten and twist, getting ready to run. And every single time she would beat them to it and escape as fast as her legs would allow her. Marinette didn't like thinking about the bad stuff. Every time her chest would feel heavy and she would start to get really sad. She didn't cry anymore. She had rules. She stuck to them. She didn't think she wanted to cry anymore. She didn't want to feel sad. The kind of sadness she felt now was different than her old sadness. It was empty. It made her chest feel hollow. She would rather cry than feel that kind of sadness. So she liked to focus on things. Constant things. The only real constant anymore was her sight. She would run through the woods, towns, and villages, and discover new things about her sight and how it functioned. She learned a lot in the few months that she had had it. Number 1. The way she saw it was by seeing the entirety of something, similar to an X-ray, but if you could see the picture of the leg and the X-ray at the same time. 2. She could not see rocks or metal. Those were the big things she couldn't see, but there were other stuff she couldn't see too. Her new sight wasn't just sight. It came with a few bonuses. If she pressed a plant hard enough, they could heal her. She learned this after getting cut by a sharp piece of metal she couldn't see, and tried to use a leaf to stop the bleeding, only to see after she pressed the leaf against herself really hard, it healed the cut entirely. Everything she learned about her sight made her more and more curious of what precisely it was, created more and more questions of what she was. Was she a meta? If she was a meta, was her breakdown in the meta a trigger? If she was a meta, then that would mean her mother had to be a meta, and possibly her grandfather, because it was genetic. Wait, no. Her father could be a meta, and have passed down the gene. They never did mention him being a meta in the whisper she had heard. They mentioned him as a detective, but never anything about meta abilities. Was she even a meta? That just didn't sit right. It didn't. She couldn't. She wasn't a meta. Something told her that meta wasn't right. Her gut knew that that wasn't right. She only dwelled on the questions when she took her breaks for sleep. Mother had a set of rules that she had taught to her, while never getting discovered was Mother's first rule. Her second was, always understand everything in a situation. Never go in only knowing half the circumstances. And right now, she only knew half the circumstances. Maybe not even half. Regardless, She really didn't have a choice about being in this situation. So her failure of Mother's second rule was definitely not her fault. Traveling as far as she could was easier than she had initially expected. When going through the forest, she was able to find berries and other fruits to eat. She learned to slow down and pace herself when eating. It took a bit longer, but she no longer had to lie down after eating because she felt sick, so she was able to move on faster. And she even started to carry a small bag with her, holding berries so she could eat as she moved. And if it rained, she would simply find a small area to hide in. It wasn't hard to find an abandoned burrow under trees, left behind by other animals. It was even easier to find them, with her ability to see where the empty space below the tree and above the dirt. When she would pass through the towns, it would be even easier. She had long since ditched her medical ward robes and grabbed a pair of sunglasses and a small hat to cover her eyes and scarring. She could see the wood of the clips used to hold up laundry to dry. It wasn't hard to identify if it really was clothing. She would see some floating wooden pins and know there was clothing on it. It was harder considering she couldn't actually see what she was grabbing. It led to her predicament of wearing a sweater that was clearly meant for an adult, though it provided her much warmth on cold nights, along with some adult men's shorts that fell to her ankles, that she had to cinch by taking a string and running it through the pant loops to tighten it, a makeshift belt of sorts. She knew she probably looked absolutely ridiculous, running through town and forest with her small bucket hat, sunglasses, an adult sweater that reaches her knees, adult men's shorts, and no shoes. She had yet to find one that would fit her, and unlike other clothing, wearing adult size wouldn't work without slowing her down. But she was looking, but absolutely no one noticed. One of the biggest things she learned was that as long as you behave normally, i.e., casually walking, no unnecessary stops, keeping relaxed, and not turning your head to look at people dead on, no one would look again at her. Everyone simply assumed she was just a little kid running around having fun. Maybe in the bigger towns, they thought she was a homeless child. Another thing she learned was that people ignored homeless children. It suits her best. Probably it wasn't good for other homeless children, but thinking about it made a lot of sense. Homeless kids were probably the saddest part of society, considering they absolutely had done nothing to end up in their situation. People preferred to simply walk past them and pretend they don't exist. It provided them a little comfort it had in their own minds to not acknowledge that these children did exist, and that they could do very little to help. One thing that was surprisingly easy for Marinette was stealing food. Little hands grabbing a loaf of bread when she knew that the owner was looking away was child's play. She was a child, so literal child's play. Stealing from street vendors that sold meat was harder, considering that they were almost continuously facing the front of their stand, where the meat was. Marinette rarely had the opportunity to steal any. Marinette thought about pickpocketing. She knew that with the training she had undergone, how she was currently surviving, and her meager appearance, she would probably be good at it. But the money was either coins, which meant metal, or dollars, which meant paper, so she wasn't able to see what she was pickpocketing. And even though people typically didn't see what they were stealing when they were grabbing it, she also couldn't see the clothing, which meant that she wouldn't be able to see whatever they were carrying their money in. And if you couldn't see a wallet, and you couldn't see the money, pickpocketing isn't really going to work. She was getting by. At this point, she could tell she was headed north. The towns were slowly trickling from mainly Arabic-speaking folk to Mandarin. She was eternally grateful for her language courses. Not only were they the only way for her to relax in Nandam Parbat and relieve herself of the near constant threat of pain or possible death if she was to fail, but it did exactly what it was supposed to do: teach her foreign language. Along with her first language, Arabic, She learned Mandarin and English. Mandarin because of how many people close to their area spoke it fluently. Many of grandfather's general's first language was Mandarin, and because it was the most spoken language in the world. She learned English because apparently that was her father's first language, and if she was ever going to actually be used against her father, as she supposed was the original plan for her was, being able to communicate with him in a way he was comfortable with would aid them. She guessed plans changed. She was completely fluent in Mandarin and could easily assimilate into the towns, which were slowly getting larger and larger, and at this point were becoming small cities. And these small cities were getting closer and closer together, and less forested areas sat between them. The villages and towns themselves were changing drastically. The villages in the area of Nandam Parbat were small, only had running water and basic electricity. But the further away she moved from Nandam Parbat, the level advancement in the towns increased. She started finding herself in cities more often than not, and Marinette found that cities were great. More people meant more shops, which meant more open food stands. The more people meant the shopkeepers were more distracted, which meant it was incredibly easier to grab a loaf of bread, or an apple, or a sandwich without anyone ever noticing. All in all, everything was going great. And just when everything was going great, Marinette got a little sloppy. She was following all her rules, but at that point she had been running around on her own for 4 months, and nothing serious had happened. Maybe a few incidents that gave her nightmares, but other than that, she had stayed off people's radars completely, and had managed to get everything she needed, and move freely as she wanted with no intervention. She got less vigilant over time, and that was her great downfall. She grabbed an apple from a cart and stuck it into the pocket of her shorts, all without breaking her gait. All smooth, fluid movements that wouldn't draw people's attention, just as she trained herself not to do. All but remembering to scout out the vendor and making sure he was not looking when she made her move. She only realized her mistake when she heard the man yelling and looking in her direction. "Hey, that little brat's a thief! Get back here, you little punk!" Marinette did what any sane person would do in these situations. She ran. Marinette had been on her own, running across the country. She was pretty sure she could say continent, because she was 95% sure that she had crossed the country's border in her little expedition away from Nandam Parbat for months at this point, and she knew that in any country she was stealing food, and stealing in general was illegal. She also knew that outside of the league, doing an illegal act was also morally reprehensible. But in all fairness, there were reasons for her stealing food from unsuspecting street vendors. She was starving, and a starving child could not run far. It didn't help that she hadn't lost the man, and could still hear his yelling about, "That little brat's a thief," and still saw him keeping steady with her. And while Marinette was really good at sudden bursts of speed to get away, endurance was one of the things that had been diminishing steadily the more time she spent in her new lifestyle. Marinette didn't know what would happen if she got caught by the man. Best case scenario was he'd make her give him back the apple, which, considering that after 5 minutes of running he was still keeping up with her, was not likely to happen. He would most likely keep her until the police arrived and let them deal with her. She wasn't sure if the country that she was in would charge a starving 3-year-old with theft for stealing an apple. But what she did know was that they would ask her questions about where she came from. She wasn't exactly sure how far away she had gotten from Nandam Parbat. She had been walking for months at this point, and she knew that she had been getting farther and farther away based off the language spoken and the size of the towns. But the areas surrounding the League's base were under tight supervision and surveillance, and if some police reported about a little girl who was blind, appearing to be the victim of some kind of acid attack or burn, about 3 years old, and refused to give up any information about where she had come from, Marinette had no doubt that it would get back to grandfather. She would not let Grandfather know she had survived. She didn't know how he would react. So Marinette did the only logical thing in her mind. In all fairness to Marinette, it was far too easy. She jumped on a train after sneaking behind a few people and acting as if she was with them, and stowed away.